It's week 2, day 1. Time to talk about React. So far, we've been doing everything using vanilla JavaScript. And when you get into something that does a lot, if it got much bigger than what we were already doing, it would get to the point where React is actually much easier to accomplish the same thing. Might not seem like it at first, in part because you kind of first have to wrap your head around the whole React thing. It is definitely a different way of thinking about application design, but it's really powerful, and ultimately it makes life a bit easier. So who knows how to read? All right, I'm all right. Tell us, what is React?
A declarative, efficient, and flexible JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It encourages the creation of reusable UI components that present data that changes over time.
I don't know what the heck any of that means. I also don't have my headset on. So the first part of that video might not sound great. It's declarative, it's efficient, it's flexible. They're reusable UI components. Declarative, I'm lost already. What? What do we mean? We're talking about declarative versus imperative. Now, those are two different types of sentence, right? It's also two different ways of writing code. Declarative, say what you want to happen. Imperative, describe how to do that thing. What's your favorite sit-down restaurant?
Let's see. I went to Steak and Shake yesterday.
Steak and Shake? All right. It's not the fanciest place in the world, but hey, it was Roger Ebert's favorite too. He had good taste. All right. So, let's do a little role play here. You be the greeter at Steak and Shake. Your line is...
Welcome to Steak and Shake.
That's right. So we hadn't started yet.
Okay. Welcome to Steak and Shake.
Why, thank you. I'm Davey. This is my friend Dana. So what I need you to do is grab a couple of those menus, get some silverware and some napkins. Don't forget the napkins. I'm very sloppy. And I want you to escort me to that table right over there. And then when we get there, I want you to set menu and the silverware on each side of the table, because I see I'm going to sit here, she's going to sit there. And then, if you could, let a server know that we're here because we intend to dine in this establishment. Can you do all that for me, please?
I guess.
Okay, thank you. Declarative or imperative? Imperative. Let's try this again.
Welcome to Steak and Shake.
Table for 2, please.
Okay.
That's the end. All right, get it? That's example 1. Example 2, driving a car. Who knows how to drive a manual transmission? Not very many anymore. You want to take off, got to push in the clutch, put the car in gear, then slowly let off in the clutch while you put the gas down, get it just right so it doesn't go like that. And then it gets up to about, I don't know, 100 RPM or so. Push in the clutch again. Do the whole thing over again. Manual or automatic transmission, just press the gas down to go fast. I mean to drive at a reasonable rate of speed. Right? All right. Example 3, making a dang web page. So we could say, grab this LI off the page. Now make a copy of that LI. Now find a button inside that LI that's labeled this way, and then add an event listener to that one, and then do all this. Or we could say, hey, for everything in this array, put an LI on the page. So here's an example. Multiply by 3. Now, yes, the easy version is just say *3. But suppose we had to write a method or function that multiplies by 3. Here we go. Assign an empty array to the variable. Set I to 0. And then as long as I is less than the length of that array, go ahead and multiply the current item of the array by 3, save that to a variable, and push that variable onto the end of the original array. And By the way, in between each time, I'm going to need you to take I and make it bigger. And then when we're all done, let's return the new array. Or declarative. Original array, map. For every item in the original array, multiply it by 3. We don't even need a return statement inside that little arrow function, right? Much simpler way of doing exactly the same thing. This is how you had to do it until we had things like map. So, piece of cake. So a little bit React is like that. That's what we mean by declarative. What else is it? It's efficient. Why is it efficient? Well, a lot of other frameworks that predate it, like Angular, the original version of Angular, AngularJS, were kind of slow because if, for example, you had a list of things. Maybe this isn't true of AngularJS, but AngularJS was slow as molasses. React has a thing called the virtual DOM, which was kind of a new innovation around that time. So what other frameworks might do, if you have a whole list of things and you change one thing in there, they're going to re-render the entire list. And it turns out that DOM operations like that are slow. We're not talking 30 seconds or anything, but they're slow enough that it just doesn't feel very snappy. So what React does is it represents all the items in the DOM as JavaScript objects. And then anytime you make a change and it needs to re-render, it compares its virtual DOM to a snapshot of the virtual DOM that it took just before your changes, figures out exactly what needs to be changed on the page, and only changes that and doesn't change anything else. The gruesome details about exactly how this works aren't necessarily important at this stage, but suffice to say, it's much, much faster and more efficient than prior ways of doing the same thing. So virtual DOM, it's good stuff. So we mentioned reusable components in that definition as well. So that's kind of what React is all about. We have a page, we're going to break it down into lots of components, and each of those components is kind of this self-contained beast with markup and JavaScript and CSS, and we just designed one component at a time, and each one's going to be relatively small and simple, and that's just going to make the whole thing more manageable. So there are 4 things you need for a React app if you're starting from zero. What you must have. You must have an HTML page with at least one empty element, because React is going to replace that element. You need to have the React library. And you need to have one or more React components. And then you need to have one line of JavaScript to attach the React component that you created in step 3 to the empty HTML element from step 1. Basic building blocks. Got to have an HTML page with at least one empty element. Got to have React, obviously, and you need to have a React component. Then you just need to tie that React component to that empty element in the DOM. So what the heck's a React component? This is some HTML, right? Pretty simple. Wouldn't it be cool if you could replace that entire thing with just this? This whole thing, that's just the header. And that's going to be on every page. So wouldn't it be cool if we could just say this? We could just make a custom element called app header and pass in the name that we want as an attribute, almost like an argument to a function. Well, that's kind of the idea. So here's the same thing as a React component. It's a little small, but if you look at the markup there, that's not quite HTML. What looks funny about it? There's a couple funny things in there that make it not quite seem like HTML. Yeah, Jacob. There's curly brackets for putting in a variable. See that? H2, welcome to my site. Curly bracket, this prop's name. Curly bracket. Yeah. Doesn't seem natural somehow. What else? There's one more funny little thing. There is, but if you just look at the lines from opening and closing header, yeah, obviously there's 3 lines of what actually looks like proper JavaScript up there at the top and bottom. But even inside the markup, there's one more thing that just isn't quite what you would do in HTML. Class name instead of class. Why couldn't we just use class, do you think? This is JavaScript. Class means something, right? So better not use class. So what you're looking at here is JSX. It stands for JavaScript XML. So it's actually closer to JavaScript than it is XML. So things like what look like attribute names, they're always going to follow JavaScript conventions. They're going to be camel cased. So even something like on submit or something, you do that all lowercase in HTML. It's camel cased with a capital S in JSX. So JSX looks a lot like HTML. It follows the rules of XML though, where things must be well formed. Among other things, you have to have a closing tag for absolutely everything. So if you have an empty element like an input, it has to be self-closing, and we'll see what self-closing tags look like. There aren't any on that page, but we'll deal with that. So yeah, you can do things like put variables in there with curly braces. Inside curly braces, you can put any JavaScript expression. But this is all just shorthand for this, really. So that in JSX, that H1, is really this. You're really doing react.createElement. Passing it the tag name, then forget the second argument for now, and then passing it its children, like the string my side is the best. So really that's what you're doing. So JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript to help describe what the UI should look like, essentially. So this thing, if we weren't using JSX, would be this. And I've had to abbreviate this because it would just go on and on and on. So kind of looks like the hideous sort of stuff we were doing last Wednesday or Thursday, whenever that was. That's no fun. It would make React kind of miserable. You can totally do it. But if you use JSX, then you get to write tags and stuff. So strictly speaking, JSX is not actual standard JavaScript. It's not part of the ECMAScript standard and probably never will be. So it isn't supported natively in browsers. So you do have to do kind of a compilation step before you run it in a browser. You have to do something that will turn this into that. But that's pretty easy to get that setup going. So we don't have to write that hideous stuff. We can write this stuff, which is much better. So let's talk about props. What the heck's a prop? You saw this dot props there on the third line. So what is a prop? Who can read? Who knows how to read? All right. Read first, Colin.
Conceptually, a React component could be thought of as a JavaScript function. They accept arbitrary inputs called props or return React elements describing what should appear on the screen.
Yeah. So you have data that you need to get into a component. You pass it props. It's just like an argument to the function, if you think of the component as a function. Sometimes a component is a function. So that's how you get data into a component. Function arguments, they can be just about anything. You can pass in strings, you can pass in numbers, you can pass in arrays, you can pass in objects, you can pass in functions, all that good stuff. They can be just about anything. So here, props look like attributes. So what we call attributes in HTML are props in React in JSX. So here we have a component called myComponent. That's our component, the class there. And down here we're using JSX to render that component. So when you write a component, you can use it as though it were just a tag. It's really nice. So here we have some props. Alert me is a prop, my fave is a prop, and name is a prop. So like we said, the value can be just about anything. If it's a string, you just use quotes like you would in HTML. So Emilio, that is a prop. It's not an attribute because this isn't HTML. It's a prop with the value of Emilio, which is just a string. If it is something other than a string, because it can be any JavaScript expression, you need to use curly braces instead of quotes. So alert me is a prop with the value alert me, which is that function at the very top. My fave is the JavaScript expression true, not the string true, but the actual Boolean value true. So inside our component, my component, you see where Emilio is there, the paragraph. My name is this.props.name. Since we pass this in as a prop, it's available to this component under this.props.name. So this.props.alertMe should be that function. And here you can see I've set onClick to be, again, curly braces, because onClick is now a prop, not an attribute. And its value is a JavaScript expression. It's a function. So it's this arrow function that calls this.props.alertMe. And this.props.alertMe is whatever we put here. My favorite Boolean is this.props.myfave. So true. As my buddy Seth always says, everybody needs a favorite Boolean. So component props are received from outside the component, and they cannot be changed from within the component. They are immutable. So once name is passed in as Emilio, this thing's not ever going to change this.props.name. That's not allowed. Not going to do good things. They're meant to be immutable inside the component. Suppose you have data that your component needs to manage, and you do want to be able to change it. That is why we have state. So in Tatum Tots, we had our array of flicks. That was kind of our state. That's the actual data that we're managing with that project. So that was the idea there. Of course, we had to go to a lot of work to keep our UI up to date with that thing. They operated totally separately. But with React, they kind of married the two things together. So let's have a look at state. If a component needs to keep track, oh, what am I doing? Who knows how to read? Jasmine. All right, so state. That's the data we use to manage our component. If we need to change anything, it has to go in state. It cannot go in a prop. Now, we could put something out of a prop into state and then mess with it there. We could do that. It's initialized in the component's constructor, and it's modified using the setState method. You do not modify state directly for reasons that we'll explain. So here's a simple component that actually has some state. We have a constructor that sets this.state to that object there. One key of count, value of 0. Now, one thing every component needs is a render method. And we always put it last. And it returns some JSX. Your render method has to return a React element. And the easiest way to make React elements is JSX by far. So we have button on click, runs an arrow function that calls this.updateCount. Okay, this.updateCount, that's a method on our class. And it calls this.setState and sets count to this.state.count plus 1. Why don't we just say this.state plus plus? Seems a lot easier. And the answer is because the previous slide told you not to. Don't do that. So what happens is state changes. It's going to re-render the component as long as you do it through setState. If you change it manually, it will not know that you've done it, and it will not re-render. There's nothing magic that happens if you do it that way. But as long as you use setState, then it will know that something changed, and it will re-render, and that's the entire point. Because we need this.state.count. in that paragraph to update when you do it. So that's why we use this.setState. And if there were more than one key in state, if there was something besides count, and our this.setState only passed in count, it wouldn't blow the others away. The way this.setState works is it only changes the ones whose keys you pass in. So you can just change one item in state at a time, and it's just fine. So we said the final thing that you need is you need to attach it to the DOM. Here's how you do that. The truth is, it's going to be in some boilerplate that you use every time, and you're not going to have to ever retype this probably, but this is what you have to do. We've got our HTML there. We've got an empty element, div ID equals root. And we've got one component, app, that just returns a single line of JSX. Then we have to call React DOM render, and it takes two arguments. The first is a component as JSX. And that's an empty element there. I said we would talk about when you do an empty element and don't have a closing tag, you need a self-closing tag. That's what it looks like. You just put a slash before the angle bracket. So that's the same as if I'd written app/app, but all in one. So we have our component as JSX, and then we just tell it which element in the DOM we need to replace. So React replaces that div with our component, and that's all we have to do. And you have to do that once per app, and that's it. Never have to worry about it again. So that is a very quick overview of React. So your homework is to build an entire React application that does everything that Tatum Tots did. No, that's not your homework. Is it? No.